James Davis walked into the courtroom with the confidence of a man who had never lost. At 45, his salt and pepper hair and expensive suits gave him the look of success that matched his reputation. As an assistant district attorney for Westwood County for 15 years, he had built his career on high conviction rates, especially in cases from the predominantly black neighborhoods on the east side. Today was the Johnson murder trial, a case that had attracted significant media attention. Travis Johnson, a young black man, stood accused of killing a local store owner during a robbery gone wrong. Davis had pushed hard for this case, convinced he could secure another victory to add to his record. The courtroom buzzed with tension as people settled into their seats. Judge Helena Martinez, known for her strict adherence to procedure, called the court to order. The defense table looked sparse compared to the prosecution's side, which was stacked with legal pads, binders, and 2 junior attorneys assisting Davis. The prosecution may call its next witness, Judge Martinez announced. Davis stood up, buttoning his jacket. The state calls Dr. Kimberly Washington to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom as Dr. Washington entered. She walked with purpose, her head held high. At 38, she carried herself with a quiet dignity that commanded attention. Her dark blue suit was simple but professional, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Davis couldn't help the small smirk that formed on his lips. He had dealt with expert witnesses before, especially ones who thought their credentials would intimidate him. He had a plan to discredit her testimony. He always did. Dr. Washington took her oath calmly, her voice clear and steady. She sat down and faced the courtroom, her expression neutral but determined. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," Davis said, standing at his podium with a casual air. "Dr. Kimberly Washington, I am a cardiologist at Memorial Hospital and an associate professor at Westwood Medical School." Davis nodded, making a show of looking down at his notes as if her credentials were barely worth his attention. "And you're here today because—" "I was the attending physician who examined Mr. Johnson upon his arrival at Memorial on the night of March 15th. Davis began his questioning, establishing the basic facts of her examination of the defendant. His questions were pointed but respectful on the surface. Yet there was something in his tone, a hint of condescension, a subtle dismissiveness, that didn't escape the notice of those watching closely. What Davis didn't know was that Dr. Washington had noticed too. She had encountered men like him throughout her career, men who saw her achievements as anomalies rather than earned through hard work and intelligence. She answered each question precisely, not giving him an inch more than what was asked. From the jury box, 12 pairs of eyes followed the exchange. Among them, juror number 8, a retired teacher, frowned slightly as she picked up on Davis's tone. In the gallery, a young reporter from the Westwood Tribune scribbled notes furiously, sensing something interesting developing between the prosecutor and the doctor. Davis flipped through his notes, preparing to dig deeper into his questioning. He was confident that, like many witnesses before her, Dr. Washington would eventually crack under pressure. He had a talent for finding weaknesses, for making even the most composed witnesses stumble. What he couldn't see was the small thumb drive in Dr. Washington's pocket, a device containing information that would soon change everything about this case, about his career, and about justice in Westwood County. Davis looked up at Dr. Washington with that same smirk. "Now, doctor, let's talk about what you actually saw that night. Let's talk about your background first, Dr. Washington," Davis said, walking slowly in front of the witness stand. His movements were deliberate, like a lion stalking his prey. "You mentioned you work at Memorial Hospital. How long have you been there?" "I've been at Memorial for 8 years, Dr. Washington replied, her voice steady. Her hands rested calmly on her lap, her posture straight but not rigid. Davis nodded, consulting his notes with exaggerated care. "And before that?" "I completed my cardiology fellowship at Johns Hopkins Medical Center after my residency at Massachusetts General Hospital." A slight murmur passed through the courtroom. Even Davis paused for a moment. These were prestigious institutions, and he hadn't expected such impressive credentials. But he quickly recovered his composure. "That's quite the resume," he said, his tone suggesting it was somehow suspicious. "And your connection to the defendant, Mr. Johnson?" Dr. Washington met his gaze directly. "I have no personal connection to Mr. Johnson. I was the attending physician in the emergency room when he was brought in with chest pains on the night in question." "I see," Davis said, making a show of writing something down. And you're testifying today about his medical condition that night? Yes, she replied. And about certain observations relevant to this case. Davis raised an eyebrow. He didn't like the sound of that. Witnesses weren't supposed to volunteer information beyond what was asked. Let's stick to what you're qualified to discuss, shall we? He said with a tight smile. Your medical opinion only. Judge Martinez looked up from her notes. Mr. Davis, please refrain from instructing the witness unnecessarily. Davis inclined his head in apology, but his eyes remained cold. Of course, Your Honor. From the defense table, Attorney Marcus Reynolds watched with interest. This wasn't the first time he had faced Davis across a courtroom, and he recognized the prosecutor's tactics. But there was something different about Dr. Washington. Most witnesses grew nervous under Davis's questioning, but she seemed perfectly at ease. Dr. Washington, Davis continued, you mentioned you're also an associate professor. What exactly do you teach? I teach cardiology and medical ethics, she answered. I also serve on the hospital's ethics committee and have published 23 peer-reviewed papers in leading medical journals. Davis hadn't asked about her publications, and this additional information annoyed him. He liked controlling the narrative. That's not what I asked, Doctor, he said sharply. I apologize, Dr. Washington replied, not sounding apologetic at all. I thought providing my complete credentials would be helpful to the court. Several jurors exchanged glances. Juror number 4, a middle-aged black woman who worked as a bank manager, nodded slightly in appreciation of Dr. Washington's calm response. Davis decided to change tactics. On the night of March 15th, the emergency room must have been quite busy. How can you be so certain about the specific details regarding Mr. Johnson? Dr. Washington's response was measured. I maintain detailed notes on all my patients. Additionally, Mr. Johnson's case was notable because of the disconnect between his symptoms and the police officer's claims about his activities that night. Davis's jaw tightened. This wasn't going as planned. Usually, by now, witnesses were stumbling over their words or second-guessing themselves. And what makes you qualified to question police reports, Doctor? He asked, his voice gaining an edge. Before Dr. Washington could answer, Judge Martinez intervened. Mr. Davis, the witness has not claimed to question police reports. She's testifying to medical observations. Davis nodded tersely. Of course, Your Honor. He turned back to Dr. Washington. Let's focus on the medical aspects then. You claim Mr. Johnson showed signs of chest pain. Couldn't those symptoms be caused by drug use? Something the defendant might have taken before or after committing the crime. As Dr. Washington prepared to answer, her hand brushed against the thumb drive in her pocket. The real cross-examination was coming, but not the one Davis expected. She had evidence that would turn this entire case, and Davis's career, upside down. But timing was everything, and she needed to establish her credibility fully first. Mr. Davis, she began, allowing me to explain the medical evidence properly will answer that question completely. 2 months before the Johnson trial began, Dr. Kimberly Washington had been working late at Memorial Hospital. The emergency room had been unusually busy that night, and she was finishing up patient notes in the doctor's lounge when her phone buzzed with an incoming text message. At first, she thought it was from the hospital's administrative group chat. But as she glanced at her screen, she noticed an unfamiliar number had added her to a conversation. The first message she saw made her freeze. Got another one of those East Side cases. Jury selection starts Monday. Need to make sure we get the right kind of jurors this time. You know what I mean. The message was from someone named James Davis. She didn't recognize the name immediately, but the next few messages made it clear this was a group chat among prosecutors from the district attorney's office. Somehow, her number had been added by mistake. Dr. Washington was about to identify herself and leave the chat when another message appeared. Washington is the attending physician on this one. Some hotshot black doctor from Memorial. Bet she'll try to play the sympathy card for the defendant. She stared at her phone in disbelief. They were talking about her. And they were discussing a case she hadn't even testified in yet. She scrolled up through the earlier messages and saw they were discussing Travis Johnson, a patient she had treated recently who had been arrested shortly after his hospital visit. Dr. Washington's first instinct was to respond immediately, to call out the inappropriate comments. But years of facing subtle discrimination in medical school and hospitals had taught her to be strategic. She took a deep breath and decided to stay silent. Over the next few weeks, she remained in the group chat, saying nothing but documenting everything. The prosecutors, believing they were in a private conversation with colleagues, spoke freely. Davis was the worst of them, regularly using racial slurs when discussing defendants and witnesses from the East Side neighborhoods. Just need one more white male on the jury and we're good. Judge Martinez is already suspicious of my selection patterns, but what's she going to do? Call me racist in open court, Davis wrote one evening. Another text read, Washington's report doesn't help our case. Let's find a way to discredit her testimony. These doctor types always crumble when you challenge their God complex. Dr. Washington took screenshots of every incriminating message, saving them meticulously. She consulted discreetly with a trusted colleague who was also an attorney about the ethical implications of what she had discovered. This is serious prosecutorial misconduct, her colleague had advised. But you need to be careful how you present this information. They could try to exclude it as improperly obtained evidence. For weeks, Dr. Washington carried the weight of this knowledge. She saw how Davis and his team were manipulating the system, specifically targeting defendants from minority communities. The texts revealed a pattern of behavior that went beyond bias into deliberate misconduct. One message particularly haunted her. Johnson is perfect. Young black male, prior record, and that neighborhood store owner was well liked. Nobody's going to question too hard when we put him away. Usual strategy should work fine. The usual strategy, she had learned from other messages, involved pressuring witnesses, selectively presenting evidence, and systematically excluding certain types of jurors. As the date of the trial approached, Dr. Washington prepared herself. She knew testifying would be difficult, but she had faced challenges before. What Davis didn't know, couldn't know, was that she came to court armed with evidence that went far beyond her medical expertise. She had transferred all the text messages to a secure thumb drive, which now sat in her pocket as she answered Davis's increasingly hostile questions on the stand. She waited patiently, responding to his medical questions with precision while watching his familiar smirk, the same arrogant expression she had seen in his profile picture in the group chat. Dr. Washington knew exactly who James Davis was, and soon, everyone else in the courtroom would know too. Dr. Washington, Davis said, pacing slowly in front of the witness stand, you've testified that Mr. Johnson showed signs of extreme stress and elevated blood pressure when you examined him. Couldn't these symptoms simply indicate guilt? A man who had just committed a violent crime might show the same signs, wouldn't you agree? The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for her response. Dr. Washington took a moment before answering, her face calm but serious. Medical symptoms don't indicate guilt or innocence, Mr. Davis. They indicate physical conditions. Mr. Johnson's symptoms were consistent with someone who had experienced a frightening encounter or threat. They could be caused by many different situations. Davis's smile tightened. This wasn't the uncertain response he had hoped for. But you can't rule out that his symptoms were caused by the stress of having just committed a murder, can you? Davis pressed, his voice rising slightly. Objection. Marcus Reynolds called from the defense table. The prosecutor is asking the witness to speculate. Judge Martinez nodded. Sustained. Davis barely acknowledged the ruling. He picked up a folder from his table and approached Dr. Washington again. In your report, you mentioned Mr. Johnson had bruising on his wrists. But you didn't specify when these bruises might have occurred, did you? The bruises were fresh, consistent with having happened within hours of my examination, Dr. Washington replied evenly, and they formed a pattern consistent with restraints. Davis's eyes narrowed. This detail hadn't been emphasized in her written report. Restraints? Aren't you overstepping your expertise, doctor? You're not a forensic specialist. I've worked in emergency medicine for over a decade, Mr. Davis. I've seen countless injuries and can recognize restraint marks. They have a distinctive pattern that differs from other types of bruising. Several jurors were taking notes now. Juror number 8, the retired teacher, was watching Davis closely, her brow furrowed. Davis changed tactics. Dr. Washington, have you ever testified for the defense before? I've testified in court 12 times in my career. 7 times for the prosecution, 5 times for the defense. I testify to the medical facts, regardless of which side calls me. Davis looked skeptical. And you've never met Mr. Johnson before that night? No, I had not. But you work at Memorial Hospital, which serves the East Side community where Mr. Johnson lives, correct? Dr. Washington could see where he was going with this line of questioning. Memorial serves the entire county, Mr. Davis. We're the largest hospital in the region. Davis approached closer to the witness stand. Isn't it true that you're actively involved in East Side community programs? That you might have a personal interest in protecting members of that community? Objection. Reynolds stood up again. Counsel is impugning the witness's professional integrity. I'm establishing potential bias, Your Honor, Davis countered. Judge Martinez looked sternly at Davis. Tread carefully, Mr. Davis. You may continue, but watch your tone. Davis nodded, not looking sorry at all. Dr. Washington, please answer the question about your community involvement. Dr. Washington sat straighter in her chair. I volunteer at health clinics throughout the county, including the East Side. I believe health care is a right for all people, regardless of where they live. That doesn't affect my medical judgment or testimony. Davis picked up another document. You wrote in your report that Mr. Johnson's injuries were inconsistent with the police account. Aren't you simply choosing to believe the defendant's version of events over trained police officers? I didn't base my assessment on anyone's account. I based it on physical evidence. The medical findings don't match the sequence of events in the official report. The courtroom was growing tense. Judge Martinez was watching Davis with increasing concern. Several jurors were frowning, either at Dr. Washington's testimony or at Davis's aggressive questioning. It wasn't clear which. Davis moved in closer, his voice growing harder. So you, a cardiologist, believe you know more about what happened that night than the officers who were actually there. Dr. Washington met his gaze directly. I know what the medical evidence shows, Mr. Davis, and evidence doesn't lie. Davis's smile disappeared completely. He hadn't expected such unwavering testimony. Usually by now, expert witnesses began to hedge their statements or show signs of doubt. But Dr. Washington remained composed, answering each question with confidence and precision. He decided it was time to undermine her credibility directly. One final question, Dr. Washington, Davis said, his voice now cold. How much is the defense paying you for your testimony today? I'm not being paid for my testimony, Mr. Davis, Dr. Washington replied, her voice steady. I'm here because I was subpoenaed as a witness who treated the defendant. Davis raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You expect this court to believe you've taken time away from your busy practice out of the goodness of your heart? Objection. Reynolds stood up, badgering the witness. Sustained, Judge Martinez said firmly. Mr. Davis, this line of questioning is inappropriate. Davis nodded stiffly but didn't apologize. He walked back to his table, shuffled some papers, and turned again to Dr. Washington. Let's move on. You've suggested that Mr. Johnson's injuries don't match the police report. Are you calling our officers liars, Dr. Washington? Dr. Washington paused, considering her words carefully. The moment had arrived. She looked directly at Judge Martinez. Your Honor, before I answer that question, I need to address a serious matter related to this case. May I proceed? Davis looked confused. This wasn't how witnesses were supposed to act. Judge Martinez studied Dr. Washington's serious expression for a moment. Approach the bench, both counsels, the judge ordered. As Davis and Reynolds stood before the judge, Dr. Washington remained at the witness stand. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Your Honor, Dr. Washington said when prompted to explain, I have evidence of prosecutorial misconduct directly related to this case. I believe the court needs to be aware of this before my testimony continues. Davis's face flushed. This is outrageous. Whatever she thinks she has. Mr. Davis, Judge Martinez warned. Let her finish. Dr. Washington reached into her pocket and pulled out the thumb drive. 2 months ago, I was accidentally added to a group text conversation between Mr. Davis and several other prosecutors. Instead of identifying myself immediately, I remained in the group after seeing disturbing messages related to this case and others. The color drained from Davis's face. His mind raced through all the text messages he had sent over the past months. I have documented evidence of Mr. Davis discussing jury selection strategies based on race, planning to discredit my testimony before he'd even heard it. and referring to the defendant and other East Side residents using racial slurs. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering above her keyboard. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," Davis sputtered. "She can't just—" "I have the messages here," Dr. Washington continued, holding up the thumb drive, "including ones where Mr. Davis specifically discusses how to manipulate evidence in this case." Judge Martinez's expression hardened. "Dr. Washington, are you prepared to testify under oath about the authenticity of these messages?" "Yes, Your Honor. And I can provide the phone number that added me to the group, which belongs to Assistant District Attorney James Davis." Reynolds, the defense attorney, looked stunned but quickly recovered. "Your Honor, the defense requests an immediate sidebar and review of this evidence." Judge Martinez nodded. "The jury will be excused while we address this matter." As the jurors filed out, many of them glancing curiously at Davis, the prosecutor stood frozen. His career flashed before his eyes. The text messages he had thought were private, the comments he had made so casually, thinking he was among friends who shared his views. "Mr. Davis," Judge Martinez said coldly, "you will remain in this courtroom while we review this evidence." The bailiff approached Dr. Washington to collect the thumb drive. As he passed Davis, the prosecutor's earlier smirk was nowhere to be seen. His face was ashen, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Dr. Washington watched him calmly from the witness stand. For years, she had worked twice as hard to earn half the respect given to her colleagues. She had faced subtle discrimination and outright prejudice throughout her career. And now, faced with the same kind of bias in the justice system, she had done what doctors are trained to do: gather evidence, make a diagnosis, and take action. As Davis sank into his chair, his hands trembling slightly, Dr. Washington thought about Travis Johnson and the many others who had faced a system stacked against them. This wasn't just about one case or one prosecutor. It was about justice. The courtroom doors closed behind the judge as she left to review the evidence, leaving Davis to face the consequences of his actions. The courtroom remained silent for nearly an hour. In the judge's chambers, Judge Martinez, along with both attorneys, reviewed the contents of Dr. Washington's thumb drive. With each message that appeared on the screen, Davis's face grew paler. "I can explain," he said weakly, as a particularly damning exchange appeared. "This was just talk between colleagues. It doesn't reflect how we actually handle cases." Judge Martinez's expression was stone cold. "Mr. Davis, one message here explicitly states your intention to hide evidence favorable to Mr. Johnson. Another discusses how to keep certain jurors off the panel based solely on their race. This goes beyond unprofessional banter." Reynolds, the defense attorney, shook his head in disgust. "Your Honor, in light of this evidence, we move for an immediate mistrial and dismissal of all charges against my client." Back in the courtroom, Dr. Washington waited patiently. The remaining spectators whispered among themselves, speculating about what was happening behind closed doors. A court officer approached her. "Dr. Washington, the judge has requested that you remain available. This may take some time." She nodded, settling back in her seat. Her thoughts went to her patients at the hospital, to the procedures she had rescheduled to be here today. But this, too, was saving lives, in a different way. At 2:15 p.m., the courtroom doors opened. Judge Martinez entered, her face grave. The attorneys followed, Reynolds looking quietly confident, Davis ashen and defeated. "The court will come to order," Judge Martinez announced. "The jury will remain excused for now." She looked around the courtroom before continuing. "In light of evidence presented to this court regarding prosecutorial misconduct, I am declaring a mistrial in the case of State versus Johnson." A murmur went through the courtroom. Travis Johnson, sitting at the defense table, covered his face with his hands. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate review and to the State Bar Association for ethics investigation. Mr. Davis is relieved of his duties in this courtroom effective immediately." Davis sat motionless, staring straight ahead. His career, built over 15 years, was crumbling before his eyes. "Bailiff, please escort Mr. Davis from the courtroom," Judge Martinez ordered. "Mr. Reynolds, your client will remain in custody pending the district attorney's decision on how to proceed with this case." As Davis was led out, reporters who had been covering the trial rushed from the courtroom to file their stories. By evening, Davis's name and face would be on every local news channel. Dr. Washington gathered her belongings quietly. As she prepared to leave, Reynolds approached her. "Thank you," he said simply. "You could have ignored those messages. Most people would have." She nodded. "Some things can't be ignored." Outside the courthouse, Dr. Washington was met by a flurry of reporters shoving questions. She declined to comment, making her way through the crowd to her car. Her phone rang. It was the hospital administrator. "Dr. Washington, have you seen the news? Your name is everywhere." "I'm just leaving the courthouse now," she replied. "The DA's office has already called us. There will be investigations, more hearings. This could go on for months." She took a deep breath. "I understand." "The hospital will support you fully," the administrator assured her. "What you've done, it took courage." As she drove home, Dr. Washington's mind was already turning to the implications. Davis wasn't the only prosecutor mentioned in those text messages. The problem was bigger than one man or one case. That evening, her doorbell rang. When she opened it, she found District Attorney Eleanor Richards standing there. "Dr. Washington, may I come in? We need to talk about what happened today." Richards looked tired, the weight of the scandal already showing on her face. "This is going to change everything," she said as Dr. Washington invited her inside. "It should," Dr. Washington replied quietly. "It's long overdue." As they sat down in her living room, the news on the television silently showed Davis being escorted from the courthouse, his career and reputation in ruins. But this was just the beginning of a much larger storm about to hit the justice system in Westwood County. 1 week after the dramatic courtroom revelation, the county courthouse buzzed with activity unlike anything seen in years. The district attorney's office had been turned upside down. Files covered conference tables and teams. District Attorney Eleanor Richards had called an emergency press conference on the courthouse steps. Camera crews from national news networks set up their equipment as a crowd gathered. Following the disturbing evidence revealed in the Johnson case, Richards announced, her voice firm, "I have ordered a complete review of all cases prosecuted by James Davis over the past 5 years. So far, we have identified 27 cases that show serious concerns about the fairness of the proceedings." The crowd murmured. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Davis has been terminated from his position, effective immediately," Richards continued. "His actions violate everything the district attorney's office stands for. We are cooperating fully with the State Bar Association's investigation." Across town, in a small apartment, Travis Johnson watched the press conference on television. After the mistrial, he had been released on bail pending a review of his case. His mother sat beside him, holding his hand tightly. "I still can't believe it," he said quietly. "If Dr. Washington hadn't been there." His mother shook her head. "All these years, we knew something wasn't right. How many others didn't have someone like her in their corner?" Meanwhile, James Davis sat alone in his home, lines drawn against the reporters camped outside. His phone had been ringing constantly. Colleagues, former friends, journalists seeking comment. He ignored them all. On the coffee table lay a letter from the State Bar Association, informing him of pending disbarment proceedings. The text messages had been damning. Not just his comments about Travis Johnson and Dr. Washington, but years of exchanges showing a pattern of racist remarks and unethical tactics. Cases where evidence had been selectively presented. Witnesses who had been pressured. Jurors chosen or rejected based on race. His wife had taken the children to her mother's house. "I don't even know who you are anymore," she had said before leaving. At Memorial Hospital, Dr. Washington continued her rounds, trying to maintain normalcy despite her newfound fame. Patients looked at her differently now. Some asked for selfies. Others shared stories of their own experiences with the justice system. Dr. Washington, her assistant, called as she finished examining a patient. "There's someone from the governor's office on the phone for you." The call was brief but significant. The governor was forming a special commission to examine racial bias in the state's criminal justice system. Would Dr. Washington consider serving as a member? That evening, as she considered the offer, Dr. Washington received an unexpected visitor. Marcus Reynolds, Travis Johnson's attorney, arrived at her office just as she was preparing to leave. I thought you might want to know, Reynolds said, setting a folder on her desk. The DA's office has dropped all charges against Travis. They reviewed the original evidence and found that officers had omitted key details from their reports. Details that match exactly what you documented in your medical examination. Dr. Washington opened the folder. Inside was a formal letter confirming that the case had been dismissed. There's more, Reynolds continued. They're reopening the investigation into the store owner's murder. New evidence suggests it might have been connected to an organized retail theft ring, not a random robbery. Dr. Washington sat back in her chair. So Travis was telling the truth all along. Reynolds nodded. Your medical report was the first piece that didn't fit their narrative. Without that, and without those text messages, you didn't need to finish the thought. Across the city, other dominoes were falling. 2 more prosecutors from Davis's team had been placed on administrative leave. The police department had announced an internal affairs investigation into the officers involved in Johnson's arrest. Local community organizations, which had been raising concerns about the justice system for years, finally found themselves being heard. Town hall meetings were scheduled, reform proposals drafted. As darkness fell over the city, Dr. Washington stood at her office window, looking out at the hospital parking lot. The decision before her was significant. Joining the governor's commission would mean stepping away from some of her medical duties, entering a world of policy and politics she had never planned to join. But if not her, then who? If not now, then when? She picked up her phone and dialed the number she had been given. This is Dr. Washington, she said when the call connected. I'd like to accept the governor's invitation. 6 months after the Johnson trial, Dr. Kimberly Washington stood at the podium in the state capitol building. Behind her sat the 12 members of the newly formed Judicial Ethics Committee, a diverse group of legal experts, community leaders, and reform advocates. Before her, a room full of reporters, legislators, and citizens waited to hear the committee's recommendations. Today marks a new beginning for our justice system, Dr. Washington began, her voice calm but powerful. What started as one case has revealed deep problems that have affected thousands of lives. But today is not about dwelling on past failures. It's about creating meaningful change. In the front row sat Travis Johnson and his mother. Next to them was Marcus Reynolds, who had gone on to represent 15 other defendants whose cases had been handled by Davis. So far, 7 convictions had been overturned, with more under review. Our committee has spent the past 4 months examining every aspect of our criminal justice system, Dr. Washington continued. We've reviewed case files, interviewed defendants and their families, spoken with current and former prosecutors, and consulted with experts across the country. She outlined the committee's key findings: racial disparities in charging decisions, inconsistent application of sentencing guidelines, lack of diversity among prosecutors and judges, and insufficient oversight of prosecutorial conduct. Today, we present 10 specific recommendations for reform, she said, turning to the first page of the report. These include mandatory bias training for all court personnel, a citizen review board for prosecutorial decisions, transparency requirements for jury selection, and new guidelines for handling evidence. From the back of the room, Eleanor Richards watched for the complex mix of emotions. As district attorney, she had initially feared the scandal would destroy her office's credibility. Instead, she had made the difficult decision to embrace the moment as an opportunity for genuine reform. It hadn't been easy. Some of her staff had resigned in protest, others had fought the changes every step of the way. This work is just beginning, Dr. Washington said as she concluded her remarks. Real change takes time, commitment, and courage from everyone involved in the system. After the press conference, Dr. Washington found a quiet moment alone in a side hallway. The past 6 months had transformed her life in ways she never expected. Her medical practice had been reduced to part-time as her work on justice reform consumed more of her schedule. She had testified before state legislators, spoken at community meetings, and given interviews to national media outlets. Dr. Washington, a young woman approached hesitantly. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wanted to thank you. Dr. Washington smiled warmly. There's no need to thank me. My brother was convicted 3 years ago in a case prosecuted by Davis, the woman explained. His case is being reviewed now because of what you did. For the first time, we have hope. Similar conversations had become common in Dr. Washington's life. At the grocery store, in hospital corridors, on the street, people approached her with stories of how the justice system had affected their families. As the day's events concluded, Dr. Washington drove to Memorial Hospital for her afternoon clinic. She had insisted on maintaining her medical practice despite the demands of her new role. Medicine had been her first calling, and she wouldn't abandon it. In her office, she found a small package waiting on her desk. Inside was a framed newspaper article with a note attached. The article, dated 6 months earlier, bore the headline, "Doctor's Evidence Exposes Prosecutorial Misconduct, Triggers System-Wide Review." The note read simply, "Some heroes wear white coats instead of capes. Thank you for your courage, the Johnson family." Dr. Washington placed the frame on her bookshelf alongside her medical degrees and certificates. Then she put on her white coat, picked up her first patient's chart, and continued the work she had always done, healing, one person at a time. Across town, in a small law office far from the prestigious firm where he once worked, James Davis sorted through paperwork. After his disbarment, he had found work as a paralegal, ironically now helping prepare appeals for defendants who claimed wrongful conviction. The system wouldn't change overnight. Old habits and biases ran deep. But something significant had begun in that courtroom 6 months ago when a prosecutor underestimated a witness who refused to be intimidated. Dr. Kimberly Washington had never set out to be an activist or reformer. She had simply done what she believed was right, using the same careful observation and commitment to truth that guided her medical practice. And sometimes, that was enough to change the world.